What was the significance of the Siege of Albazin? The Siege of Albazin was a military conflict that occurred between the Tsardom of Russia and China's Qing dynasty from 1685 until 1686. Ultimately, it ended with the Russians surrendering the fortress of Albazin to the Qing government and the Russian abandonment of the area around the Amur River, and in return the Russians were given trading privileges in Beijing. Background to the siege. After the earlier Battle of Hutong in 1658, the Russians made no formal attempt to gain control of the Amur River valley. However, they did actively compete with the Manchus for the allegiance of the people living in the area. In 1667, the leader of the Hamnagan Buryat clan, Gantamer, refused a request from the Qing to join them militarily against the Russians. In fact, he and his people sided with the Russians. The Qing tried to win back his favour with gifts, and when that did not work, demanded his extradition, an act the Russians refused to comply with. The Qing at that time were unable to mount a military expedition to the region due to their having a lack of supplies to counter any Russian opposition. Russian territory to the west of Lake Baikal, the world's deepest lake, was consolidated in 1661 with the founding of Irkutsk. However, expansion to the south was halted in 1663 after a defeat in the Urankai territory. Russian migration into the area intensified after the relocation of exiles from both Poland and Lithuania. One of those exiles was Pole Nikifor Chernigoysky, who in 1665 murdered his guards at Ilimsk and fled with a gang of escaped prisoners to Albazin, where they rebuilt the fort. In 1672, Russian authorities in Nerchinsk formally claimed Albazin. Chernigoysky was captured and sent back to Moscow, where he was pardoned and returned to the Amur Valley. Unlike other parts of Russia's far east, the lands around Albazin were fertile, and the land surrounding the fortress quickly grew to a settlement with farms existing throughout the valley. Qing presence also expanded across the region up to the 1680s that included forts at Aigun and Mergen and a dock at Girin. An office was set up at Buta to administrate the hunter-gatherers of the Greater and Lesser Khingan Ranges. Siege of 1685. In June 1685, led by Lang Tan, an army of 3,000 Qing soldiers laid siege on Albazin. The fortress was at that time held by approximately 450 Russians under the control of Alexei Tolbuzin. According to Russian sources, the Qing had a great might of guns and even more powerful cannons, more powerful than the Hongyi Pao or Red Barbarian cannon. More than 100 Russians died during the first day of bombardment and surrendered the following day, with survivors permitted to leave for Nerchinsk, while some Russians preferred to remain, having defected to the Qing. Albazin, any nearby villages and a monastery were razed to the ground, but for some reason the crops were untouched. Siege of 1686. The following year, led by Tolbuzin, the Russians returned to Albazin to harvest the crops. On this occasion, they built a stout fortress, and with the help of a Prussian military expert, the walls of earthen core were reinforced with a combination of clay and tree roots. In July 1686, Lang Tan returned to Albazin with another military force of 3,000 soldiers and laid siege upon the fortress once again. However, this time the Qing were unable to penetrate the walls despite several attempts to do so. On the 23rd of July, the Qing attempted a direct assault on the southern wall but were forced to retreat after suffering heavy losses, while the Russian defenders were able to take some Qing as prisoners. However, the Russians became too confident in chasing their attackers away and fell into a trap as a carefully executed ambush was conducted by the Qing. Due to the redesigned structure of the fortress, the Qing were unable to gain entry into the fortress or sufficiently damage the structure through constant bombardment. By early August, the Qing had established a perimeter around the fort and cut off the Russians from their supply of drinking water. By the end of August, a complete blockade had been erected, which led to sickness among the Russian defenders, and by the end of the siege in early November, less than 150 of the original 800 to 900 defenders remained alive. The Qing had also suffered heavily, losing around half of their 3,000 strong army. The final battle saw the Qing retaking the fort and killing Albazin in the process, with many of those defenders that had withstood the siege dying during the final onslaught. A message was dispatched to Moscow offering trade in return for the Russian withdrawal from the Amur River Valley. Other sources to the outcome give a different version, claiming no final battle and peace negotiations between the two sides ended the conflict. Of this version, Russian envoys arrived in Beijing seeking peace in October 1686. When messengers arrived in Albazin that December to announce a Russian withdrawal, there were only 24 Russian defenders still alive. Those survivors were permitted to leave, while the Qing army withdrew from Albazin the following year. The Russians were permitted to rebuild their villages and cultivate their fields, but were not permitted to hunt, as this was viewed as infringing on Chinese territory. Albazin was eventually relinquished to the Qing in the Treaty of Nerchinsk in 1689 in return for Russians being given trading privileges in Beijing. Aftermath and conclusion. Fearing that the Kori or Solon would side with the Russians, the Qing had their communities relocate to land under the control of the Manchu. In August 1689, the Treaty of Nerchinsk saw the official surrender of the Amur region by the Russians to the Manchus. The treaty allowed the Russians to trade in Beijing, and a caravan route was set up from Nerchinsk via the Noni River. The treaty was the first between the Tsardom of Russia and the Qing dynasty. The Qing further consolidated their presence in Heilongjiang with garrisons in Chikaha and Buta in 1691. However, they made virtually no attempt to control the frontier along the Amur River, preferring to depopulate the tribal people from north of the river to lessen the threat of border incursions. The Treaty of Kayakta was signed in 1728 to demark the international border between the two empires in what is today northern Mongolia and China's northeastern Heilongjiang province. Kayakta became a border trading town with populations of both Chinese and Russians. Between the Chinese town and the Russian fortress, two posts were planted, one inscribed in Russian and the other in the Manchu language. That brings us to the end of this video that highlighted the story of the Siege of Albazin that went a long way towards shaping part of the international border that exists today between Russia and China. If you've enjoyed watching and it's shown you a little detail of life and events here in China, then your subscribing to my channel would mean a lot to me. Thank you for watching. Make sure you click on the link to the next video, and until the next time, goodbye for now.